I also had the chance to visit Beirut, the PLO in Beirut in 1981, just before the Israeli invasion of 82. And that made me a lifelong supporter of the Palestinian cause. I mean, just meeting them broke through all the layers of propaganda, even as a, socialist, revolutionary activist I had internalized.
And I have a friend in the Netherlands who is actually a psychologist, also a clinical psychologist. We were study friends. And he told me about one of those guys who just sees racism everywhere. And I think it's an Indonesian or a Surinamese guy. And 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 he says he sees racism everywhere. And my friend, he actually said to him, he said, I don't think you have a problem. He said, most likely you're seeing reality. And he was baffled. He was like, this is the first psychologist who actually says this to me. And I'm like, there you go. You know, most psychologists, like you said, Benji, are trying to mold people's thinking pattern in a way that you fit back into that sick system. It's not the system, it's you. You know what I mean?
There's an implicit thing in Australia. It's really weird, man. Like Australia is a weird place because it's so like young, and so there's this general thing where we all know that we all know that our lives are built on like this sort of genocide, right? Like of the indigenous people, and some of us like almost do a wink, wink. Yeah, we feel bad about that shit. You know what I mean? Like, but yeah, because they even make you do it in track back to history almost and tie you to it in history and go, yeah, 200 years ago those people did that, and that's linked to your white skin, but baby, right? So
We had a history teacher, and I was still, I think, maybe 14 or something, very young, early high school. And I never forget that. So you can also see how that shapes you the rest of your life. And I remember there was this teacher who just disliked me for some reason, and I remember one of the neighbor kids talking to me, and I never forget telling that neighboring kid, I said to him, "Don't talk to me because he will punish me for it," you know. And immediately he replied. Immediately the teacher said, "Ah, hey, Karim, what are you talking about? I understand you don't want to listen about a topic. I understand you don't want to listen about the topic that discusses women's suffrage and women's rights because you have a dad from Algeria." That's the thing that just flaps out of him immediately. Oh, of course you're talking again. I understand you don't want to talk. You don't want to listen to a topic about women's rights because your dad's from Algeria. And I was 14 years old, eh? I was 14 years old. Imagine what that does on a repetitive basis when you grow up. People always say, "Oh, why you talk about these racism or microaggressions or whatever?" Because these are expressions of a system that continuously produces these kind of microaggressions, which shape people's brains, also yours, you know, everyone's brain. Hello, everyone. Good day to you all. We are here again with Benji and Sasha. Well, Benji, you've seen him before, but Sasha is new. But he's also part of the Resistance is Fertile podcast, and I think these guys are doing really, really awesome stuff. So definitely go to their channel. And Benji and Sasha both are psychologists, just as Peter and myself. Even though we are academic psychologists, both of you are clinical psychologists, if I am not mistaken. And today we're going to talk a bit about how our sick system is mentally colonizing not only people in the global south, but actually all of us. I think that is a very important topic. I just got a major grant here in Hong Kong to study colonial mentality and do it cross culturally. So to study it among people in Singapore, Hong Kong, Malaysia. So that it's a topic I find exceptionally fascinating, and I see you see it all around you. It's everywhere, and in my opinion, it's also in the West. We're all mentally colonized. But before I talk too much, maybe it's an idea for you guys to just introduce yourself a little bit for our audience, and then we can jump right into it. So let's start with Sasha.
Hey, so my name's Sasha. I'm a clinical psychologist in Brisbane, Australia, and I mainly work with children. But my PhD is in forensic psychology, and I worked in criminology for a long time. Did some stuff over in Uganda, looking at mental health over there and how they see it differently from Western sort of mental health. And I'm currently the Australian rep for the Palestine Global Mental Health Network. Um, yeah, and I co-host the Resistance is Fertile podcast.
Great name, by the way.
Benji?
Yeah, so I'm Benji Schoendorf. I'm a clinical psychologist currently living in the settler colony of Canada near Montreal, where I see clients. I actually used to be a far left anti-imperialist activist in my younger time. I famously edited a magazine back at Oxford with one Keir Starmer, who I was completely unable to politically educate, clearly. And I'm also autistic, which means I'm really bad at politicking in general. So I gave up active politics early on and eventually became a clinical psychologist. And I also had the chance to visit Beirut, the PLO in Beirut in 1981, just before the Israeli invasion of 82. And that made me a lifelong supporter of the Palestinian cause. I mean, just meeting them broke through all the layers of propaganda, even as a, socialist, revolutionary activist I had internalized. And then the flood happened on October the 7th, and I just had to speak out again. Like, I had to do it because I'm a father, I have a 12-year-old, and I just needed to know for myself that my son could know that his dad had spoken up. It's strange to say, but this is why I started speaking out, not because my voice is particularly, interesting or I have a big audience or anything. And I just decided I would do it. And I started doing it in our, international psychological association. And this is how Sasha and I came together. We'd met before, but just, on the professional plane. And we met because we were one of the few people who actually spoke up to no effect. And that's how we decided we do this podcast. The first name we thought for it was Sifting Through the Rubble, which I thought was quite good because I thought, the whole empire, the whole structure, the mental structure also of the empire has collapsed. Like the flood has washed everything in front of it. And then, you have to sift through the rubble to find what can still be used and rebuilt. But my co-host thought that was too pessimistic. And we had this great phrase, Loki, I think, said it somewhere. And it was, oh yeah, resistance is fertile, is the great thing. And my interest psychologically is in integrating new advances in experimental developmental psychology, process-based psychology known as relational frame theory, with I'd say, Marxist liberation psychology that integrates all the insights from Frantz Fanon. So this is kind of my project at the moment. I'm working on it. I'm producing videos on it. I'm writing about it. Maybe I'll be writing a book or something. And eventually, my biggest dream is to escape the West and maybe go to China, where you are, guys. Maybe mainland China, if I can. I'm learning Mandarin at the moment, and my first mission is to go to China in summer 26 and give training workshops for therapists, which I've been doing for the past 14 years or something, in mainland China in Mandarin. So that's me.
Cool. Good luck to you. Um, I
Absolutely.
wonder if I could I have something that I'm very curious about because, I and Kareem both write about the negative psychological effects of neoliberal capitalism and the system in which we're all enmeshed. But it feels like to me it's one thing to point out how the structure of our political economic system can cause all sorts of pathologies, but it's another thing entirely to actually try to solve them for people. And I'm just curious if you could, if either of you or both could just give me a short idea of what is it like to actually attempt to undo the harms of this system that we all are, you know, crushed by to various extents.
See, as you were talking, I was thinking about the children I work with, right? And I'm thinking about the children and I'm thinking about the psychic battleground, like the idea of like our psyches have always been ripe for exploitation, you know. So it happens externally, it happens internally, right? I was thinking about in Australia, we've got these like in grade three, they do these exams for the schools. They do these big exams, right? And this 8-year-old girl says to me, I need to do well in this exam. I'm like, why do you need to do well? Because if I do well in this exam, I'll get a good job. If I don't do well, I'll get a bad job, right? So even at the age of 8, so you think about the like cognitions, so the structure they're trying to create, right? Like the link there, grades equals good job, like, and I'm like, oh my God, you're like 8 years old, right? So, you've got that, but then you've got some other examples I thought of, like the whole idea of pocket money, right? Like, think about how the capitalist stuff is like, then that doing chores or whatever becomes like a transactional relationship, between parent and child. So they're capitalizing, they're always, or the parents do it themselves, really, right? Um, and then the other memory that comes to me is, I think I was like grade 1 and I was sitting in the quadrangle in the sun and they gave us our first bank account because it's, kids aren't allowed to have bank accounts legally, right? So, and they make you feel so proud that you've got this bank account, right? Like, and now when I look back at it with the knowledge that I have, I'm like, man, like when you look back on a traumatic memory with that shame sort of feeling, like it sort of, you have that sort of shame sort of feeling. So I think, it's about increasing everyone's awareness of what is actually happening in their psyche and what's going on and what are the thoughts that um, say the government or whatever is trying to get them to fuse with, like, because they internalize these sort of ideologies through rituals, through like the bank ritual or through little interpersonal rituals, but then also through like just the subtle like thoughts that get sort of put in there, right? That you then just attach to, and then you just treat them like it's fact. Like this is just the world,
Mm.
right?
But do you find that you find some success in trying to undo this damage by getting people to think about how these cognitions that they're having are essentially imposed by the system that they might not agree with? And does that itself help them to stop those cognitions, or how does that work?
I think it can. I mean, like change can happen in a number of different ways, right? Like, so change can happen gradually. Okay, so here's a good example. I had a young adult guy come in last week, typical white, like I guess colonial boy or whatever, right? And out of nowhere, so this guy tried a few different jobs and was really good at these jobs, but he was just wasn't satisfied, right? Comes into the session, and I've known this guy since high school, so and I've never sort of explicitly sort of said anything to him about, the capitalist mindsets or anything like that, because in the therapy room, you sort of in with the respect for self-determination sort of thing, you try to like not influence people one way or the other, right? So it's about educating, not influencing. But anyway, this guy comes in and he just out of nowhere turns around and goes, I realized it doesn't matter what job it is, I'm just not happy, right? And then I thought of our interview with Indica, like, and how Indica's story was all about, I just didn't feel happy, like, and that sort of sadness. And this guy basically decided he's just going to leave his jobs. He was lucky that he has some money that he made. He's just going to leave his jobs, sell his stuff. He bought a one-way ticket, like out of the country, right? He's like, I'm just going to go, like, and but it was layered with all of Kareem, all of the capitalist Kareem sort of like he was just talking about the plight of his generation. This poor guy was in tears with empathy for his generation of, that they're getting pushed further and further out because of property prices and everything. No one can think of buying a house or anything like that. But then he also unpacked that thought, right? That young people come in with this stress of like, I'm not going to be able to afford to buy a house. So my approach to that is, so the banks have done such a good job. They're getting you stressed about not going into debt for the next 30 years of your life. Like that's the cycle that they've sort of created. So this guy spontaneously just came to this, and I mean, he knew that I did the podcast and everything, but I think all these events, and I think Trump and Musk in particular, like their masks off, like is shaking, people in Australia up like big time. And then yeah, so he just woke up, like basically became one of the free people that Benji was talking about, right? And one of the aware people, the awake people, and it broke through those layers, and so it can happen, I think, with a combination of events. Once they walk out of that therapy room, I can't control all those variables that come into their lives, right? But then it can happen really powerfully in the session where they have that moment of, oh man, so this thought came from there, like.
I think a lot of people actually. I'm not. Maybe I'm being too. I'm applying too much of my own psychology on others, but I do think a lot of people deep inside have that dream to one day just say, "Fuck it all," and put everything down and just live. Yeah, so get out of the system, fly where you want to go. Sometimes with envy, I remember when I was a teenager, but also later. I mean, but less, but especially during my teenage years and early 20s, I remember looking with envy at birds and cats around our neighborhood. And I always wondered, why am I so envious of these animals? And then I realized, like, yeah, because they just wake up and they just do. Not they do this or they just do. They just live.
Free.
They wake up, find food, have sex, find friends, have a fight when you don't like someone, and the rest of the day relax in the sun, walk around, come home, get your food, and do your thing. And as human beings, I think at our core, we are also we just want to live and not and do our thing, but not be put into that kind of system where we have to do all these things, which, like you also just said, Sasha, which makes us think it's natural. I mean, you're 7, 8 years old, and a child already thinks, "Oh, I need to get good grades to get a job," and most people don't even challenge that thought. That is natural. They think that's human nature. You know
Oh,
what I
take a
mean?
step back. Take a step back and go, school is 5 days a week. So that's 5 days a week that just so happens to line up to the work week, 5 days a week that you are taking from children. Like, and sometimes I'll say, like, I get lots of kids. So we got a type of disorder called school refusal, right? Which when you think about that disorder, you're like, what is that? That's someone refusing to participate in the system, right? Like, and there's a lot of overlap with autism. There's a lot of people with autism, they just see right through that shit, right? And they're like, why should I go and like respect this teacher? Like, I don't know this person. Like, why should I sit in that classroom? Why should I have, and what they're saying is, why should I have my freedom taken off me? Right. But I'd say most kids just mindlessly, and parents, they not because it's their fault, but there's a mindlessness to it as opposed to mindfulness, right? There's a mindlessness of, this is just what you do. You go to school 5 days a week, like that's what you do. But if you really step back and think about it, in Australia, it's legislated, right? I often think like, man, how did parents, consent to that? But what I'll say to kids is, look, let's flip the context. If you've got adults and you put them in a school context, you said, you're going to go to this building, you're going to study these subjects, you're going to have these lunch breaks. And if whatever you don't do, we're going to give you homework, and we're going to give you homework anyway. And if you don't do it, we'll take your lunch break away from you. How many adults are going to go to that job?
So,
That reminds me of I had played football with high school kids in the neighborhood, and we were exchanging names. And one of the guys says, "You can just call me Fried Chicken." And I was like, "Huh? How'd you get that name?" And he said, "Well, one day I was in class and I was falling asleep, probably because he was staying up too late doing homework. But anyway, I was falling asleep, and the teacher came by and just yelled at me, 'If you don't focus on your studies, the only job you're ever gonna get is frying chicken.'" And it's like that story you just had with the young girl of 8 years old, like internalizing that pressure.
Benji?
yeah. Yeah. So my approach to clinical psychology is to basically work for self-determination. And I think, what's happened with the advent of capitalism is it's made us individually into those little islands. And we have to sell our labor power. We have to build our own little lives. We have to do all these things, and which wasn't the case, in more traditional societies that evolved over a very long period of time, and people were just part of them. And, they had, of course, their shortcomings and whatever their hierarchies. But there was a sense of, a system that was kind of stable over time and evolved over, hundreds of years or whatever. And capitalism has just blown all of this apart. And we find ourselves just trapped into those systems. And I'm just fascinated about how the world works, how it works on the material level. This is why I resonated very much with the Marxist analysis. But then the shortcoming of that is it doesn't actually look at how it works or psychologically for each and every one of us. How do we get into those systems? How do we continue them? Like, the big question is, how come with universal suffrage people didn't vote for working class parties and stop voting for the exploiters, for the capitalists, for the imperialists, for the genociders? And yet they did. And to understand that, you have to look at how these things reproduce individually, right? And they do because of the way human cognition works, which has been identified over the past 40 years as really being based on very simple behavior of relating things with one another that we learn from just interacting with other humans. And eventually this thing happens when we start making connections that are not directly learned. Animals can't do this, only humans can do this. And once you start being able to do this, you derive these connections, and then it makes very complex networks. And these networks actually change the meaning of things. And the meaning is not just what it refers to, but also what it makes you feel, what it makes you do, whether you approach something, whether you move away from something. And that is the source of human identity, of self-meaning. And those self-meanings evolve over time. And for many of us, and increasingly in capitalist societies, because we're all kind of in competition with one another, we evolve or we get trapped inside self-meanings that are based on inequality. They're based on I am less than or more than, but not in terms of ability or size or what have you, but in terms of fundamental human worth. So, before you're 10, you're going to be trapped, or some sense of yourself is going to emerge, maybe something like, I'm bad, or I'm broken, or I'm empty, or I'm invisible, or I'm disgusting, something like that. And then as you grow to adolescence, you're kind of going to wonder, why am I, whatever, say bad? And something will emerge out of this network, some meaning will emerge, which will tell you, well, I'm bad because, say, I'm not good enough, right? And that becomes kind of your realization of your essential character, if you like. And then you start living, interacting with this as you're a teenager. And depending on how you interact with it, you're going to feel some dominant emotion. Say you try really hard to succeed at the next thing, and you do. But then the next thing comes up, and, well, you're still not good enough. So you're not sure if you're going to succeed. And then the next thing comes up. Well, clearly you're going to feel a lot of anxiety. And by the time you reach adulthood, you're going to identify with, I'm anxious, right? But now imagine that maybe what happens to you is you try really hard to be good enough, and then something or someone thwarts you often enough, then you're going to feel more frustration, maybe anger. And then as you reach adulthood, maybe you're going to start thinking, well, I'm angry. So you see, we start living inside those systems of self-meaning identities. And there's also a side of it that's kind of my social identity, or me in relation to others, or my community. And when they are based on this fundamental inequality in terms of human worth, and this emerges very early on, like before 10, then that is the source of most, probably every syndrome in the DSM, except maybe two or three, right? And then the job of clinical psychology, which of course is an individual job, is to dismantle those systems of meaning going back the other way. So maybe you start with I am anxious as an identity with this emotional experience. Then you go to I am not good enough. You dismantle that. You go down to I am bad, say, you dismantle that. And once you've done that, that moment emerges of complete self-determination. I don't believe psychology can tell you what a good life is. I don't believe, it's like Freud imagined it's because you want to kill your dad and, sexually have non-consensual sexual congress with your mother or whatever. I don't believe it's about, living your values. I don't believe these are just prescriptive stuff from the outside. I think it's just about freeing yourself from those systems of domination, also on the material level, but here we're in the clinical room, mental systems, and then just be whoever you are, just, reach that point of self-determination. And this is where the individual clinical work connects with the collective work of liberation, which is again about, self-determination, collective self-determination, whether it be, your community, your nation, your class. But of course, the limits of clinical psychology is we can only do it at the individual level. And once you free folks from those individual verbal systems of meanings, well, they're still living in a capitalist, imperialist, genocidal political economy with all the ideology around them. So you can't complete the work. But anyway, so that's my approach to clinical psychology. It's about personal liberation, self-determination, with the limits that, of course, you can't in the clinical room change society.
Yeah. Yep. Very, very good. And what I find interesting about both of you, Sasha and Benji, is that you do the same as what Peter and myself are doing in psychology, and that is very rare, by the way, surprisingly, but in a way also not surprisingly, that is connecting the macro to the micro. And many, many mainstream psychological theory books, etc., only focuses on the micro, as if the macro is just a natural environment that is unquestionable, and we just have to navigate that social system that we are in without questioning that social system. And I find it so interesting what you just said, that you start identifying with the pathologies that are put into you by the capitalist system, such as, oh, I'm an angry person, oh, I'm an anxious person, oh, I'm an insecure person. I find insecurity also a very important one, because it reminds me of a Indonesian Dutch woman that I spoke to many years ago, and she was a descendant of course, colonized peoples by the Dutch, and she said and she said it in Dutch. She said the Dutch put into our mind, and she called it trapjesdenken, which literally means thinking like, how can I say that? Staircase thinking. So that is almost the literal translation, staircase thinking. What she means is that the Dutch colonizer put hierarchical thinking into our mind. So lots of Indonesians internalized a deep sense of inferiority once they became socialized in the Dutch capitalist system. And that is very much related also when you mentioned Frans Fanon, of course, in the beginning. And it also reminds me myself of something from my youth that I remember. We had a history teacher, and I was still, I think, maybe 14 or something, very young, early high school. And I never forget that. So you can also see how that shapes you the rest of your life. And I remember there was this teacher who just disliked me for some reason, and I remember one of the neighbor kids talking to me, and I never forget telling that neighboring kid, I said to him, "Don't talk to me because he will punish me for it," you know. And immediately he replied. Immediately the teacher said, "Ah, Hey, Karim, what are you talking about? I understand you don't want to listen about a topic. I understand you don't want to listen about the topic that discusses women's suffrage and women's rights because you have a dad from Algeria. That's the thing that just flaps out of him immediately. Oh, of course you're talking again. I understand you don't want to talk. You don't want to listen to a topic about women's rights because your dad's from Algeria. And I was 14 years old, eh? I was 14 years old. Imagine what that does on a repetitive basis when you grow up. What that puts into your mind, what that says about your identity and how that shapes the way you think about it. And I had my days as a young kid the, in certain spaces just hiding my background because I just knew how much judgment there would be. But that's already how the system colonizes your brain, internalizes that kind of wants you to internalize a kind of sense of inferiority. You know what I mean? And it reminds me of a discussion I had yesterday with Vijay Prashad, and we talked about how white supremacy works. It's on a micro level. You put on a television and you only see white heroes, and then of course it's on a macro level how capital maintains its wealth mostly among white men, old white men, which of course reproduces that system, and that also has an effect on our brains, and that is a bit yeah, that is, in my opinion, so important for people to understand how people always say, oh, why you talk about these racism or microaggressions or whatever? Because these are expressions of a system that continuously produces these kind of microaggressions, which shape people's brains, also yours, everyone's brain. And I don't know. I don't really have a question. I just wanted to say that I really appreciate how you guys do that. You also tie that collective, that macro to the micro. I don't know if any any of you wanted to respond to that.
Well, I don't want to respond to that exactly, but you reminded me of a part of the conversation you had with these guys earlier, at which point I started screaming at my screen that I was watching you guys on, and that was I think when Benji was talking about the argument that some people will present to try to defend keeping psychology as a purely microscopic science, purely individual focused science, and any attempt to bring in the macro or the structural, the political economic is wrongheaded. Why? Because that would be quote unquote ideological. And that just blew my mind. I have no doubt that there are people who will make that argument. But what blew my mind was that's coming from psychologists. So that level of naivete about ideology, I find shocking and I guess shameful that there would be people that have such a naive view of ideology. The way that most people define ideology now, or the way it's used most commonly, is simply to describe whatever structure you have for your own beliefs about how the world works and how it should work. So in that sense, not ideology as a form of kind of intellectual pathology, but simply as a descriptive term for the way that we think, individual people think the world works. That means everybody has an ideology. So the idea of somehow putting up a cordon sanitaire between your psychological science and the political economy of the country you live in or the world really you live in is just so silly, like fundamentally silly, like laughable. And lastly, I'll just say, like, I think there's a philosopher of science who does the best work I've seen on this question, Miriam Solomon, in a book, Social Empiricism. She basically says, look, there are all sorts of factors that influence scientific decisions. Instead of calling them biases, which is a pejorative term, why don't we just call
Uh-oh.
background, your life experiences, etc. All of them are decision vectors. We'll pick this anodyne term that has no pejorative connotation whatsoever. Decision vectors, because throughout the history of science, the various individual characteristics of scientists, the fact that they grew up poor or they grew up rich, or they were non-white in a white country or a woman in a patriarchy, whatever the all of those different things, those are have very often in the history of science been very positive decision vectors. The example that I always remember is the example of a female sociologist who was looking at the existing sociological research on divorce, and all of it was looking at the negative effects. Are children worse off? Does income go down after a divorce? Whatever negative things. And because of her experiences, she was like, you know what? I'm going to search for positive effects because I know from my experience and from my feminist ideological development that there are a hell of a lot of very unhappy, abusive relationships. And in those cases, divorce can lead to, an improved psychological well-being. So it just, when hearing that, it really just set me off because it's like if any profession should be more sophisticated in thinking about ideology and how it works and what its effects are, that profession should be psychologists. So this argument that to bring in the political and economic into a discussion of social psychology, mind you, to say that that is inappropriate is just purely laughable to me.
Well, yeah, those are really important points, and I think it goes both ways. Like for a very long time, there's been this kind of very simplistic left-wing Marxist understanding of psychology. Stemming from Marx saying, in any epoch, the ruling ideas are the ideas of the ruling class. And then it kind of stops at this. It goes, okay, it's all about economic factors, and that explains everything. And that's kind of too simplistic. And on the other side, you have capitalism, which doesn't want you to look at its backside, right? I mean, it doesn't want you to pull the curtain and look at what's going on. And if you're into pulling curtains and looking at what's going on, you're not going to make a career in this particular or any field in this society. So I think there is that, and we need a kind of more sophisticated understanding of psychological processes, which we still haven't really evolved. Psychology, for all the research, for all the different branches of psychology, is, to my mind, where physics was in the early 19th century. There were all these theories, the phlogiston, this or that, and there's, any number of theories, but there isn't yet a common understanding of how things work. So it can go in every direction. And then you talked about vectors, decision vectors, and those are also very important. In fact, this is how we come to live inside systems of meaning. We relate things to one another, it makes very complex networks, and all these things become like vectors. They're almost like weather systems, where you have all these, it's a dynamic system, it's very complicated, and you have all these different vectors, and sometimes they go in the same direction and they will bring a hurricane in certain, latitudes, certain seasons with certain conditions, and other times nothing will happen. And we need to understand how these things come together. And I think this is kind of what is missing. And also the fact that anyway, there is no prices to be had for saying, well, and the work that, Kaim's article is amazing in that sense. Maybe you're suffering from capitalism here. Maybe this, political economy has some particular consequences that we need to look at.
Yeah, yeah. And I would say that so when you said the decision factors from Solomon, was it?
Yeah, Miriam Solomon.
It's funny that you say that because I remember in one of my papers on perspectives on psychological science, I actually questioned the word bias, and I said that these are natural adaptations. Biases are natural adaptations to the way you have been socialized and unculturated. So why would you call racism a bias when it's continuously reproduced in our societies? I mean, I can show you that racism is not a bias. How can I show you that racism is not a bias? Well, I can do what a lot of people do. They do anti-bias training. They train police officers and everything to anti-bias training, and within a month you're biased again. Why? Because it's not your brain that is the mistake here. It's your social environment that conditions you to be so-called biased. It is not a bias. It's just an adaptation to your environment. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
and I don't know if you read well, Benji, but I did mention political economy in my article. So maybe you should read it again.
Yeah, how, as I was listening to you earlier, Kareem, I think there is this very deep contradiction at the heart of systems of meanings. And you see it in very young children. And I remember distinctly having this experience as a young child of not getting inequality right. I just couldn't get it into my head why there were some people begging in the street, why there was, because when we first look into another human's eyes, we see that we're the same. We see that, there is something that is the same in us. And then gradually, those systems of meaning start emerging, and very often they are systems of meaning based on less worthy than, more worthy than. But we never lose that sense that deep down we are the same. So you have this contradiction at the heart of the system, which kind of mirrors the contradiction, of the capitalist political economy, where it's will eventually reach its limits because it's trying to extract and extract ever more. And these unequal verbal systems, systems of meanings, they also are in very deep contradiction with this immanent sense of being the same that we can get just by looking into anyone else's eyes, right? And I think that's where, on a psychological level, we get trapped into those things. So you can do any number of anti-bias training. If you haven't dismantled the system of meaning inside of which you're trapped, then all those vectors that Peter mentioned are going to actually become coherent with your system of inequality. So you have people in the Zionist colony, who in their family and with their friends are the most compassionate, caring, loving, vulnerable, open people to one another. But they're inside the system that says, oh, those animals out there in Gaza, in the West Bank, they're not human. And maybe, they go and do reserve duty where they just, joyride cars and shoot people randomly in the streets because they live inside those systems. And I think this is the way you can also understand the colonizer and the colonized mind. Once you're inside those systems, they have their own rationality, and it makes sense to stay inside of them. It's not stupid, it's not irrational. You stay inside of them. It's somewhat similar to the way people stay inside abusive relationships, right? And as clinical psychologists, we have great experience with that. People come, they describe an abusive relationship. Sometimes they even say, I'm in an abusive relationship, but they can't get out of it. And if you try to push them, it actually has the opposite effect, right? So you need to really be with them. You need to meet them where they are, to see things from their perspective, and gradually help them find a sense where they can dismantle the rationality of staying inside the system and reach that point where they go, oh no, I'm going to be my own person here, and I'm just going to move on or do whatever I need to do to be truly myself.
I mean, I sort of would map it out also like this, like the flip side of that is, like, okay, think of a clinical psychologist, they start university, there's a disconnection. So they try and disconnect you by separating you into your disciplines like sociology, psychology, political, right? So it goes from that, and then they have all their jargon. So a psychologist has no status to talk to a sociologist or to publish anything in a sociological journal, right? Then you follow that progression. You then become a clinical psychologist. You get trained to assess, diagnose, treat disorders, right? And it's funneled into this like, narrow frame of reference. And that's one of the reasons why the research on the human processes hasn't moved, because it's all focused on the disorders and treating the disorders. But essentially, it's just an internal stuck system where you're treating the symptoms of being in the bloody system, right? Then so that's my training. Then I start working with kids. And the more I start working with kids, because kids are so inherently, they're just learning about the systems, right? So they're getting introduced to the systems and they're more likely to push back against the systems because they're more aware. And this is why awareness is the key. So being aware that there is a system, being aware that you're trapped, like, right? So that's why it's that waking up part is so important. Now, the psychologist that isn't aware of what's going on is just going to mindlessly coerce that child to engage in the system the same way most parents mindlessly coerce their child to engage in the system. No, you have to go to school. No, you have to go to school, right? Parents will get fined if their kids don't go to school for a certain number of days. But then if you pay attention to the children and what they have to teach you, they taught me about the system, right? Like, and made me open my eyes to the system and then my role in it. I mean, I did educate myself through the anarchist thinkers, right? So I went through the Kareem's thing about the hierarchical structures of how our minds are structured. And I found the anarchist philosophers were a really nice link between those internal hierarchical structures and the external, like, oppressive sort of systems, right? So I started looking at these kids through this sort of clinical psychology anarchist sort of lens. And the parents bring them to me going, make my child go to school. And then I'm just there going like, hey, man, I totally get why you wouldn't want to go to school. Why would you want to go to school, right? So the running joke is we diagnose the schools as having autism because, part of autism is about rigidity, right? And I'm like, well, the schools are pretty rigid, man. Like, I think we should sort of diagnose them. So it's that awareness of like, this is why I think, the way Benji's talking is sort of new and unusual for even within sort of the clinical psychology realm, because most psychologists will mindlessly diagnose disorders and treat them. And for me, it was like I realized, do I really just want to spend my time helping people live with colonial life? Like, is that, because then me doing that, I'm doing the exact same thing. So then, when the flood happened, that made me sort of go, I reached out to, like, say, people in Lebanon and stuff like that and did training with them. And, but these are the layers that they get you with those external layers of separating the disciplines, disconnection, which then is also, you look at disconnection of apartheid. That's an apartheid strategy, right? Disconnect people. Even the flyer strategy they dropped over Gaza, it's about disconnection, right? No one in the world cares about you. I mean, how cold and heartless is that? Side note, the reason I'm so angry at all the other psychologists that haven't spoken out is that seeing those sorts of behaviors, you know so much more about what's behind that and the lack of empathy and the psychopathy and how that would make people feel, right? But yeah, sorry, that was a ramble. But so then you start to unravel yourself as the kid's unraveling, and then you're also helping these kids free from the system, like at that younger point, right? So then they can go on to, but yeah, go ahead, Benji.
But yeah, this point about working with kids is also really important. So I'm a generalist. I work with, adults, kids, couples, teenagers. And with kids, essentially, I work with parents and I teach parents to leave their kids the fuck alone. And once they do this, everything improves. Like, because it goes back to autonomy and self-determination, right? We are in systems where basically everybody is infantilized, dehumanized. In fact, just this Western idea of childhood, as this other state, is also reproduced in the colonial systems. Basically colonized peoples, they're like children. At best they're like children, and you need to educate them, and children need to be taught this and that and shown to. But that's crazy. If you look at the history of humanity, you had kids, 8-year-olds working on fields. Now we look at that and say, oh, that was horrible. Some aspects of it was not nice, but they were able to do so much. You didn't need to be behind them all day when they were working on the fields or on the farm or whatever. we are able to self-determine in ways that we deny one another. And so with children, when I work with children under 12, I almost exclusively work with parents, and I teach them to leave their kids alone, to give them more autonomy. And lo and behold, they discover that their kids often enough are old enough to, be responsible for whatever we're working on. And then everything improves because the parents are just there as backup in support, but they have granted that fundamental sense of equality. Hey, I see you as a fully, autonomous human being. Of course, you may not have my abilities as an adult or whatever, but that's not what we're talking about. And now we can cooperate. And that is so strong. And that is also what is, lacking in the colonized and the colonizer minds, where we basically have this hierarchy. We know because we are the most advanced civilization. We have Greco-Roman, blah, 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 and all those philosophers. In the West, we actually believe we are the only people who have philosophers. We know nothing of other cultures and societies. And because of all this, you're kind of like children, and we can't grant you autonomy because all hell would break loose, right? It would be like, that book, Lord of the Flies, is really the Western idea of children. They are this beast, impossible, and you need to repress them, otherwise all hell will break loose. And that is such colonial mindset, and we are doing it to ourselves. We are doing it to our children. I listened to this conference with Michael Parenti, and he said, where are all the children? 30 years ago, you'd walk in the streets of any Western country and you'd hear children everywhere, and they'd have their own cultures and their own chants and their own songs and their own games. And
You
these
even
days, you
see
don't
it
see
when you
them
see these
anymore.
very old videos of the beginning of the
Yes,
20th century, these
yes.
black and white videos. You see kids everywhere.
And you don't see them anymore. They're like prisoners. You take them out maybe at most 2 hours a day. And you know what? If you at 7 years old, 6 years old, I used to walk the streets, walk to school alone. If you do this here in my, settler colonial suburb, let your 8-year-old walk the streets alone, you get child protection services banging on your door the next day. We have even carceralized our own children, our own selves, and then we grow up inside those systems. Is it any wonder that we have this explosion of syndromes? And then we create this profession of clinical psychology whose job it is to actually fit people back into the fucking boxes and go, no, 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 no. We are going to, change your cognitions, your emotions so that you can be a happy little cog in this inhuman machine. Because when we look into each other's eyes, we can see we're all the same. There is, you're not more human than I am. How could this be? Because you're 5 years old or 95 years old, or because you're brown, because you're makes no sense at a deep
Peter,
level.
Peter, who said that again? Who said that again? It's not a sign of health if you're well adapted to the current system.
Martin Luther King Jr.
Martin Luther King
Oh,
Jr.
okay.
Right, right. Yeah, it reminds what you just said quickly. I think Peter wants to ask something. A quick comment on what you just said, Benji. It reminds me of the critique I always have about psychology and the way it deals with people who have a problem with racism. And often you will see that these people get behavioral cognitive training to train their thinking, because it's often blamed on the individual. So in other words, you're paranoid, so you need to change your thinking to stop seeing racism. Okay, so it's most likely your problem. Either have a pill, eat a pill against it, or change the way you think. Cognitive behavioral training. And I have a friend in the Netherlands who is actually a psychologist, also a clinical psychologist. We were study friends. And he told me about one of those guys who just sees racism everywhere. And I think it's an Indonesian or a Surinamese guy. And he says he sees racism everywhere. And my friend, he actually said to him, he said, I don't think you have a problem. He said, most likely you're seeing reality. And he was baffled. He was like, this is the first psychologist who actually says this to me. And I'm like, there you go. Most psychologists, like you said, Benji, are trying to mold people's thinking pattern in a way that you fit back into that sick system. It's not the system, it's you. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? But sorry,
Yeah,
Peter, go
to
ahead.
be well adapted to a sick society is not a sign of health. Something like that was the line, which is exactly what you're arguing there. Yeah, I wanted to actually return to that point Sasha was making earlier about the Asal conversation. Though I noticed that we're past the normal hour time, so I'll try to keep it brief, which is going to be really hard because this is actually an enormous topic. But um, there are so many aspects of that conversation. The one I wanted to focus in on is I don't often get the chance to pick the brains of clinical psychologists. And I also very rarely read novels. So I worry that I'm missing out on a whole realm of human experience and knowledge that might be very important. But I bring this up simply to say, in my view of psychology and how it interacts with political economy, at the core, everyone, almost everyone, believes that they're a good person. That whatever it is that they believe, they're a good person. Their beliefs, if implemented in reality, would make the world a better place. And it's really only people with really serious mental illnesses like psychopathy that don't have that belief necessarily that they're a good person. And that forms a really big part or a kind of foundation for my thinking about how the media operates in influencing people. But to avoid a 5 hour conversation, I really just wanted to get both of your views on that kind of core part about human nature. Do you, because you've actually had a lot of clinical experience, so perhaps what you've discovered in talking very intimately with people about their thought processes, maybe you'll find or you found that that's not actually the case. But could you illuminate that a little bit for me? Because we could get to this later about how it becomes relevant in thinking about the media and politics relationship. But I'm just curious if you would agree with that basic view that most people think that they're good people, regardless of their ideology. They think that their ideology is correct, they're good people, and if their ideology were running the world would be a better place. Is that a fair thing to say, or in your experience, are there a lot of people who just disregard that, who say, fuck it, I'm bad, I'm doing what is good for me and screw everyone else, or I don't really care about good or bad, or what do you say to that?
You want to go, Benji? I know you can go, Benji.
Yeah, I want to go. Okay. Well, I don't, maybe I have selection bias being a clinical psychologist, but I can tell you very, very few of my clients deep down think they are good. Well, it depends. Some people, again, if you go back to that first self-meaning that emerges before you're 10, some people will have the self-meaning I'm bad emerge, which was my case. So for those people, being good is going to be really important, just to not be bad. But a lot of other people will be, I am broken, I am defective, I am invisible, I am nothing, I am empty. And that forms their core identity. So it's not that I believe they're a good person or a bad person or whatever. That good and bad thing also is very, Western in a way. I don't think it's necessarily at the core of each identity. However, we come to live into those verbal systems. I call them systems of meaning. And inside of that, everything that you think, that you feel, that you remember, that you tell yourself, and that you do has its own logic, and it makes sense. So that's, I think, what you're referring to. Again, if you're trapped into, you really see it, and you must, if you're not clinical psychologist, you must see this in your everyday life, in your friends, in your family. People are trapped into extremely oppressive relationships. They know it, but somehow it's right for them to stay inside of them because it has its own logic. And this is how people, keep their heads down and go, oh, we need to survive. We just need to make it to the next day. Yes, the conditions are not perfect and everything. And on the ideological front, what happens is you have these systems of unequal human worth that are reproduced, that we live inside, and they make sense. And so, yes, we are the master race. Yes, we are the chosen people. Yes, we are the best civilization. Yes, we have this, are that. But I don't think at the end of the day it boils down to being good versus being bad. It boils down to this works for me, this doesn't, and this is the way I've come to see things, to see myself, and to see society. So that would be my take on this. I would just leave this good and bad thing to one side because it's an epiphenomenon in many ways.
I would add to that by saying, I guess the way I approach that is, well, I felt part of what you might be talking about is we want to see ourselves as good people. I think inherently we want to see ourselves as good people. So something that comes up with parenting and kids and stuff, right, is when kids have this sort of shame reaction thing, or no, it's more when like kids lie and try to avoid responsibility, right? Like because they're avoiding that feeling of shame, of like that sort of shame feeling, because deep down inherently, I think they want to see themselves as good people, right? Now, I think that ties to some of the macro stuff in the sense of for someone to wake up, I mean, for someone to wake up to their country, to the culpability of their country in a genocide, they have to de-identify with the country, right? Because they're identified with it. So if they're bad, then I'm bad. So in the sense of they want to see themselves as good, they want to keep seeing their country as good. So they want to keep betting on it and hoping on it, and like they want to keep seeing the electoral process as all good and valid. So they want to keep investing in it, right? Like, so I think that's one of the barriers and one of the things that once people realize who you are, like once they lean into self-determination, right? And they realize, and that's what the resistance is fighting for, right? Like they're showing us it right there, right? They're fighting for self-determination, but it's for all of our self-determination, right? Once they realize that, they can unentangle their behavior is not me. And I'm, and then they can sit there and go, oh my God, yeah, Australia's participating in a genocide. Australia's done this, America's done that. The Netherlands has done this, and
Actually,
Yeah.
that's also why I always say people should stop investing in all these colonial identities that have been created for us, such as when people become so allergic and so sensitive when you talk about white or white people. And I'm like, why do you take this personally? It's just a colonial identity that has been created by some unscientific psychopaths who wanted to dominate other human beings. It has nothing to do with you personally. You know what I mean?
but part of that, I think, is the blank slate thing, right? So when they set up a colony, they take people from other parts and they put them here, right? Not on their land, right? So take Australia as an example. And so that you basically have to like blank slate of people and create a new identity that ties to the colony, right? So the thing is, these Australians, if we take Australia as an example, right? Once you rip that away and you go like Australia's bad or whatever, or you're not Australian, or you know what I mean? Like, and they don't have anything to like fall back on. I think that leads to fear and anxiety, and you know what I mean? Like, because they are so invested in it, right? So, and
Yeah.
that's the difference with, yeah, like with we've been talking a lot, Nunja and I, about the blank slates and how they basically blank slate us. And that's what makes it, that's what leads to, I think, a lot
And
of our
and,
disorders and what
and
makes
it
it so,
damages all of
there's
us.
something missing, right? Something missing.
And it
Yeah.
damages all of us. I mean, Gerald Horn often keeps repeating that. Hey, like all of a sudden, when all these Europeans came to the United States, they became white. And the funny thing is you know what? It's a damaging construct, not just to the victims of white supremacy. Actually, everybody's a victim of white supremacy, by the way, but it's also very damaging to those who so-called benefit from white supremacy because it completely erases your own distinction as a human being, not only your individuality, but also your deep cultural roots, your indigenous roots. Let's say you're Polish or you're Greek or you're Portuguese or you're Norwegian or you're Dutch or you're British. All these people are lumped together on the shores of America, they have to look each other in the eye. Oh, you have blue eyes. I have blue eyes too. Forget about our thousands of years of cultural heritage. We're the same now. Forget about all that beautiful indigeneity that we also had. We completely erased that. We're now that simple, ridiculous identity of being white because we lack melanin in our skin. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
And I,
Benji had brought up Michael Parenti earlier, so I thought maybe a nice bookend would be bringing up another thing he said, which is relevant to what Sasha just mentioned. It was part of a lecture. It was used as the beginning to a left-wing punk song. I think it was like Black Flag or Anti-Flag used it, but he basically says, "I wish, our friends on the left would stop using the word we." Like, we bombed Iraq, we invaded Vietnam. We didn't do that. They did it.
That
And
is what
it
I
just
always
came to
say.
mind. Yeah, exactly. It came to mind because if it's so difficult to get people to extricate themselves from these national identities, and part of the reason is once you point out the evil things that these governments have done, that reflects poorly on the individual because they have this national identity. Get rid of that. It's they doing it. It wasn't you. Oh, oh.
Sorry, forget it
missing
again.
the best
No,
of
I have been
Kareem. Go
complaining.
ahead.
I've been complaining about that indeed already for many, many years, and I remember also being on other people's podcasts who were just, and these were American interviewers. Let's see if I can still find them, but okay, not important. But I remember being on podcasts, and I've been frustrated about that already for many, many years. Especially you see that among Westerners a lot. Like for example, very well-meaning leftist, anti-imperialist podcasters in the United States, for example, always about we invaded Iraq, we bombed it. Why are you identifying with these psychopathic leaders of yours? You didn't do that. You resist them, right? You try to resist them. So why, in God's name, would you say we invaded? It's they invaded. You have nothing in common with these people. Absolutely nothing in common. You know what I mean? Anyway, you wanted to jump into what I just said, Benji. I saw you were itching to say
Yeah,
something.
I think there is something peculiar to the settler colony, right? It needs to erase everything. And it's not even a black hole, there is a white hole at the center of it. And if you think about it, nobody is white, but white is actually not even a color. So you have to erase everything and to claim everything is white, and we are all these blank slates, and we need to reinvent ourselves every day because of the needs of a particular political economy that needs to turn us into commodities. So the more you wipe out where you come from, your connection to a land, to a culture, to a history, the better it's going to be. And then you're going to build that empty we around. And that way just relates to that. I think it's capitalism, and Gerald Horn on that is brilliant. It's not just capitalism, it's capitalism joined at the hip with supremacism because it justifies the domination, right? Unequal worth, so we can dominate them. And it needs to wipe everything white to the point that even you have to wipe out humanity, become transhumans, and wipe out the earth and fuck off to Mars, like Elon Musk wants, who I think is the best representative of the logic of this crazy system. And we need to go back to no, 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 we're all humans here. Yes, we're all different, but we're all basically the same as humans, and we can self-determine and just escape the white hole of whiteness.
We can
Well
actually
said.
use that in different ways. A white hole instead of black hole, but also, shut up, man. You're such a white hole.
That's what you want before diagnosing yourself with depression. Make sure you're not surrounded by a bunch of white
White
holes.
holes.
But why are you crawling up that guy's white hole?
Yeah, they think the sun shines out of their white holes, right?
Yeah, indeed, indeed. Well, it's been great talking with you. Thank you for being so generous with your time. We've gone over by 20 minutes without a complaint yet,
Oh,
so thank you.
And I'm
yeah.
suggesting that we're gonna make this a regular. We cross some time. Some stuff is happening geopolitically, and then we come back. I think
Yeah.
we have good psychological uh, uh, how can you say that, discussions and conceptions about the things that are happening around us, and I think the audience can really benefit from these kind of discussions. So that would be really great. I hope you guys
Yeah,
agree.
I certainly do. I mean, there is any number of really good geopolitical analysis out there. And I don't know, personally, I don't know that I can contribute that much to it. That is just isn't repeating what someone else is saying, maybe even more sharply than I could. But looking at it from the psychological angle, I think is a very unique thing we can bring to the party. And with you guys doing the social psychology part of it and us looking more at the impact on the individual, I think it's a winning combination. And Kareem, I want to talk with you about your research because I think, the way I'm looking at psychological processes these days could actually integrate into a more precise way of doing social psychology. And yeah,
Absolutely,
so we need to talk
absolutely.
about
Sounds
this.
good. Yep.
This is my life's work for the rest of my days.
Sasha,
Trying
any
to escape
final
this white
words?
hole.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I had a
quite
great
well.
time. I think Nunju will be happy that she learnt more about the colonial mindset and how the colonial minds work. And she learned a bit more about Kareem, I think. I feel like I almost like sat in a bit of a therapy session and Benji sort of therapized us a little bit. Like I got a bit hypnotized there for a while. But happy to
I
come back
feel
in.
healthier already. More less adapted to the environment.
I feel like I found some treasure in
Wait
the
until
rump.
you get the bill. Thanks, guys.
There's a great song by my favorite band, The Coup, called "Ass Breath Killers," and it's all about a pill that destroys, like subservience and kissing ass, basically. It's a classic song. I recommend you guys check it out.
Is that going to
Okay.
be what you title this episode? Ask breath killers.
So one final question, Sasha. Where's your last name coming from?
Well, Rombouts is Dutch, actually, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah. I
my
was just thinking
dad,
you must be a local, but you
yeah,
must be
man,
coming
no,
from
my
close where
dad,
I'm from. But
he came to Australia from the Netherlands, and then yeah. So whereas my mum came from like the British side of things. So it's two colonies, and he never taught me Dutch either because I don't know whether he was trying to acculturate or whether he also because I think he had the awareness of how bad the Dutch were based on the stories that he told me. Like he told me some pretty full-on stories.
well, and the funny thing is, in the Netherlands, we think the opposite. We were the good, or the Dutch. Here, I go we also. The Dutch were the good guys, and the rest of them, the British, and they were all the bad ones. But it's the same with me. I mean, my dad's Algerian, my mother is Dutch, and my dad also never how can you say that, unculturated me into his culture, which I think is a shame. But I always say, with one leg I am in the world of the colonizer, and with one leg I'm in the world of the colonized. So it gives one a more nuanced perspective, because I genuinely think that in many ways I do get the mindset of both sides. Growing up in a mostly white family, because my parents were divorced quite early. But on the other hand, of course, also navigating life as a mixed individual in a completely Western white country gives you a completely different conception, than when you are homogenous, ethnically homogenous. But anyway, that's a interesting topic for another discussion. But rombouts, yeah, I was thinking like, oh, okay, that must be a local, originally a local for me then. But yeah, very recognizable.
So as
Guys,
we say in settler colonies, totally indigenous to Australia.
yeah, 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 exactly, exactly. Yeah. So do you feel any guilt, Sasha, of being there?
Oh, I let go of that. That doesn't belong to me, remember? That belongs to like them,
You're
right?
right,
Like,
right.
there's an implicit thing in Australia. It's really weird, man. Like Australia is a weird place because it's so like young. And so there's this general thing where we all know that we all know that our lives are built on like this sort of genocide, right? Like of the indigenous people. And some of us like almost do a wink wink. Yeah, we feel bad about that shit. You know what I mean? Like, but But yeah, because they even make you do it in track back to history almost, and tie you to it in history and go, you know, yeah, 200 years ago those people did that, and that's linked to your white skin, baby, right? So
Yeah, right. Exactly. Well, that's many interesting topics for the future, I guess. For now, guys, thank you so much. That was very great. Also, you have been very generous with your time, so thank you for that as well. And let's talk again soon.
Yes, indeed.
Thanks for having us.
Absolutely.
All right, bye, guys.
All right. Have a good
Bye.
night. Bye.
Bye.